Rules of politics, economics, public policy have changed so much so quickly because of things like globalisation and the internet and all the dizzying social change of the last few years that actually comparisons like that are really a bit futile.
Yes, I think that's right. I think in one sense it's very, very hard to compare New Labour with pretty much anything that's gone before for the reasons that you've set out. We live in times that are increasingly uncertain and unstable with the global economy. There's the rising middle class. There is issues of convergence, political convergence over the centre ground. However, that said, there have always been groups, particularly within the Labour Party, who have sought to revise, to think again what social democracy means in Britain, from Hugh Gaitskell and then people like Anthony Crossland. And then perhaps you could make an argument to say that the Gang of Four, who set up the SDP, would be an example of this. But straight comparisons do certainly have their problems.
And one of the things that for example, comes out of this globalised era we live in is that it's very difficult for this Labour government, as previous Labour governments once did, to promise to tax the rich until the pips squeak. Because if you try to do that, the rich move on and you don't get any tax out of them at all. So you end up with a situation where the rich, the very rich, the hyper-rich, the hedge fund managers and whatever in the city are probably paying less in a marginal rate of tax than certainly the middle classes, possibly even, as someone famously said, they're cleaners.
Yes, I mean, I think in one sense, for the British left, the great problem is what do you do about the super rich? And if you believe in the welfare state, if you believe in high-funded public services, if you believe in a conception of social justice that says we've got to increase people's opportunities, we've got to increase people's capacity to achieve and to earn and to lead a more comfortable kind of life, then you have to use some redistributive mechanisms. But how do you do that? And how do you do that when a lot of us feel that we're already paying too much tax? And also, if you're quite concerned that there might be flight, capital flight or flight of certain citizens and certain businesses elsewhere. So this is a dilemma for the British left.
And is the answer that New Labour's come up with essentially that the middle classes have to pay for it, not the rich?
I think most certainly one thing that marks out New Labour is their, well, pragmatism or timidity, depend on how you see it, towards taxing. And by that I mean direct taxation on incomes of the very, very rich. However, in one sense, New Labour has been quite bold because it has raised taxes, indirect taxes, and has used that money to redistribute and fund certain social programmes. So,
yeah. And another thing that New Labour seem to have ditched is old-style economic nationalism. Once upon a time, it would have been inconceivable that the national steelmaker could have been taken over by a foreign company, or indeed a succession of foreign companies. The national car maker, all sorts of firms that in other countries would be national champions that would have to stay within the ownership of someone from that country, are in Britain cheerfully flogged off to the highest bidder, whoever they happen to be.
There is definitely an attitude in New Labour at the heart of government that, in one sense, what matters is what works. It doesn't matter if a company is British. Is a company going to be productive? Is it going to employ lots of people? Are there going to be long-term, good quality, stable jobs in certain communities? And if that is provided by foreign firms, so be it. Now, that's not necessarily the right way to go, but I think you can say quite confidently that in the global marketplace, the Labour government has picked certain winners, but in the realm of manufacture and in the realm of kind of actual industry, I think it's made a decision to say we don't necessarily excel at that now. That's not where our competitive advantage is, and therefore we'll let the global marketplace do its thing.
Well, these are all quite controversial things within a party that, after all, was at one point based on sort of metal bashing, coal digging, shipbuilding, whatever, unions of that kind. Is this something that happened to Labour sort of on the job in government, or is it something that was brewing in the mind of Tony Blair long before he became the Prime Minister?
these ideas have been developing within the Labour Party for decades. I don't personally buy into the view that 1994, when Blair became leader of the Labour Party, or there was some sort of epiphany, and he thought, right, let's ditch everything that's gone before. There have been people on the Labour right who have revised, who have reconsidered, who have thought the times are changing. How do we apply our values in a changing world? That said, I think one of the things we try and bring out in this book is that New Labour has definitely changed. It has departed from quite a lot of traditional Labour Party policies. And the great debate amongst political scientists in Britain regarding New Labour is, do they owe more to traditional social democracy, or do they owe more to kind of Thatcherite neoliberalism? And that's a debate in itself.
Well, that's a debate encapsulated in your own book, isn't it?
Well, that's it, yeah.
Your co-editor is someone who thinks that New Labour is basically neoliberal, and you think it's a bit more Labour.
Yeah, I think New Labour most certainly has accepted a great deal of the Thatcher major settlement, but it still is on the centre-left. And I think there is evidence of that. My co-editor and my dear colleague Simon Lee at Hull University, he takes a negative view, you could say, and he does believe that New Labour owe more to neoliberalism in a way that they follow on directly from Major, Thatcher, Keith Joseph. And I think that's at the heart of quite a lot of the discussion about the centre-left in Britain at the moment.
And it is quite an interesting question for the Labour Party itself. How comfortable is the Labour Party that still exists, in some cases quite unreconstructed Labour Party that still exists, with what has been going on when their party's been in government? I've got this fascinating essay in there by Professor Phil Cowley at Nottingham University, which dispels this idea that Labour backbenchers are basically sort of bleep sheep obediently doing whatever comes up on their pager.
Sure.
That is, it's amazing how that's managed to persist as a myth that these people do as they're told, when in fact they're, incredibly rebellious?
I think Phil Cowley and Mark Stewart are absolutely correct on this. Labour backbenchers are not supine, they are independent-minded individuals. They are people who've been in the Labour Party for most of their lives. New Labour is not the entire parliamentary party, it never has been. It's been a powerful group of modernisers within the National Labour Party. And even within New Labour there is this fault line, not just as simple as Blair and Brownites, although it's often fallen, the debate has fallen that way, and it's reported that way. But New Labour is a group of modernisers who believe that the Labour Party have to really hold on to the centre ground and embrace a fair bit of the Thatcherite agenda for them to be able to implement certain centre-left ideals. But the Labour Party is quite a diverse organisation, and if you speak to people, committed members in different local parties around the country, you'll find that an awful lot of them do harbour more radical perspectives, and I think that's fair enough.
You say more radical perspectives want, the good old blood and thunder, nationalise everything in sight.
Oh, well, I'm not quite sure about that. I think Labour members are often very pragmatic, and they know very much that elections have to be won at the centre ground. However, many people do feel that the New Labour have been too cautious, too conservative with the small c. They did expect more, and they are hoping that with the change of Prime Minister, perhaps you'll see more traditional social democratic policy. That's what I'm told when I speak to them.
It's social democracy, Jim, but not as we know it.
You could say that.
But at the same time, Gordon Brown is the co-architect of New Labour.
Right.
He was there, probably more responsible for it in many ways than Tony Blair, the whole policy framework he set out in the Treasury. So is that just a triumph of old Labour body language over New Labour policy substance?
I think it can be seen like that. Gordon Brown is the co-author of New Labour. He had control over economic and social policy. Never has a British government been run so effectively by two people. I also do think that Gordon Brown is quite cautious, and he is moderate. That has been, in one sense, part of his success at the Treasury and as a frontline Labour politician. But at the same time, I think now is the time to deliver and to show that he is more than a New Labour politician. He is more than a co-author of a very moderate project which has won elections. And I think a lot of people in the Labour Party are waiting to see what policies are going to be proposed for the next election. And I think they'd like to see things with a sharper shade of red.
Well, in the meantime, though, there's also the question that arises, and now that Tony Blair has left the stage and is employed gainfully elsewhere in a number of different projects, is New Labour just going to dispel a sort of puff of smoke, and we're going to discover that the Labour Party hasn't really changed underneath? Or is there a permanent mark now? Can the Labour Party snap back to what it was before Blair?
I don't think it can, and I don't think most people want it to. I think there is going to be a period of discussion and debate, I think, within the National Labour Party. I've said it a moment ago, I'll say it again, New Labour is not a national organisation. It was a very, very powerful, very successful movement within the elites of the Labour Party. And
a clique, you might almost say.
I think it's more than that. I think it's more than that. And I think the reason why I think it's more than that is there are certain think tanks and there are certain publications that are very much New Labour. So it's more than just the whim and the fancy of a couple of powerful individuals. And I think, like I said, you can detect historically people throughout the post-war period who have wanted to be more reformist, to embrace the centre ground, to be less socialist. And one of the discussions I think people are going to be having in the run-up to the next election is how does the Labour government, under the Prime Ministership of Gordon Brown, brand itself, market itself, not just to the general public, but also to the disaffected Labour voters who have gone elsewhere at the last election.
Because you do wonder about the sort of tensions that are setting up within the Labour Party now, and can the Labour Party, as it's currently constituted, in the long term, contain the ideology that is New Labour? Or are the people who want, the heady wine of old-style socialism going to find somewhere else to go? I
think those people who wanted that heady wine of old-style socialism have gone. And I think they've long gone. I think that one of the discussions will be, do we want a more traditional, perhaps Crosslandite social democracy? Do we want a form of a halfway house, perhaps between where Kinnock was in '92 or Smith? Or do we want something that's more kind of ultra, more kind of market-focused? And I think that's perhaps the ideological spectrum that I understand. I think the days of kind of widespread nationalisation, not that we've really had that for nearly half a century. I think those debates, all around the Bennites in the early 90s, I think they've long gone. I think that left in any meaningful sense doesn't exist in the parliamentary party. It doesn't exist in the majority of the constituency parties.
But it doesn't seem all that different then from what you hear from. You talked about the convergence on the centre earlier, from what you hear from the likes of David Cameron. There isn't that much difference. It's a contest on who might be the best manager of basically the same system.
I certainly think in terms of marketing, in terms of political campaigning, persuasion, yes, there's a convergence around the centre ground. I think that's absolutely right. And I think in the same way that New Labour had to accept some of this more popular and arguably successful policies of the Thatcher Major era, I think David Cameron's having to do the same regarding being pro-public investment, being you don't hear very much about tax cuts from the Conservatives at the moment, having to move left on issues of the environment, on issues of social responsibility, Britain's responsibility to Africa and on third world debt. There's no great talk of dismantling the welfare state. I think in some senses New Labour have won the battle of ideas, and David Cameron is moving left, but this is a very small piece of ground. This is a very a crowded piece of political ground.
A very crowded battleground to fight on. Matt Beech, thanks very much for joining us. Book Talk will be back again next week. Join us then.